Well, the UN is sounding the alarm on human trafficking and slavery in Southeast Asia. In its latest report, it highlights the scale of the crisis, which has been fueling scam operations around the globe. The UN found that some 300,000 trafficked victims from more than 65 countries have been forced to work in scam centers across the region. The majority of victims are said to have been deceived about the nature of the work or the conditions in which they would be forced to live in. Several individuals that have been rescued or released from these scam compounds have reported wage theft, debt bondage and extortion, as well as inadequate medical care, food, housing and severe sleep deprivation. Many recount being forced to work up to 19 hours daily for months without a break. Digital technology is reportedly a main tool used by scammers and recruiters in Southeast Asia. And the UN says more than half of survivors were contacted by recruiters via social media, with most connected through Facebook. On top of that, the rise of generative AI is playing a role in scam operations, from generating scripts and multilingual content to identifying targets, producing deepfakes and facilitating money laundering. International enforcement efforts to crack down on scam centers have resulted in the periodic rescue and release of victims. The UN noted such scam syndicates often collude with local government officials, making dismantling such operations all the more difficult. And for more on the report and its findings, we're now joined by Pia Oberoi, Senior Advisor on Migration and Human Rights at Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. And Pia, thank you so much for joining us. You know, the report says trafficking into scam centers has reached the level of a humanitarian and human rights crisis. What makes this crisis, fundamentally different from earlier forms of labor trafficking?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I mean, indeed, this is the report that we put out is an update on a report that we put out in 2023. So the question really was, 3 years later, what has changed? But also, why are people still continuing to be trafficked in? And we've all seen the pictures, we've all seen the reports of the scale of the operation. And what we're witnessing now, really, and as you see in our report, what we've detailed is really the brutality that victims that are coerced into working in these scam operations experience on a daily basis. And so we've been looking at some of the protection aspects. There are widespread reports of torture, of brutality, including families that are being extorted through having to watch their loved ones being tortured on live video stream in front of them. These are very deeply entrenched and very brutal operations where violence is part of the business model to enforce compliance, to get people to carry out the scam operations on a very, very large scale. So the protection aspects are of great concern to us because the people that are at times being released or rescued from these centers come out of these centers with really profound need for psychosocial treatment, for medical treatment, and we're very, very concerned about their situation.
Absolutely. And international and ASEAN frameworks, clearly recognize the non-punishment principle. Why has it been then so difficult for the United States to apply this in practice, especially when victims are forced to commit crimes?
Well, one of the concerns that we have indeed is that we're not seeing adequate screening and identification of the people that are being released. We really welcome recent attempts to close down these operations in various ways. And our report details some of those enforcement actions, as well as actions by the international community to follow the money, to trace, where the criminal operations are located. What we're not seeing in a similar way, though, and this is one of the recommendations that we have, is that the released victims are being subject to what we are kind of seeing as a culture of disbelief, that they are being re-victimized, they are being portrayed as criminals themselves, whereas, as you note, the non-punishment principle for victims of trafficking, that is indeed, integrated into ASEAN legal instruments as well as guidelines on the non-punishment principle, make it very clear that people that have been trafficked should not be subject to further penalty, even for crimes that they may have been forced to commit, or for immigration violations in the course of their trafficking experience. So again, I think what we're really calling for is for an individual-based screening and identification to understand the situation of these many, many thousands of people that are being released or are managing to release themselves from these operations, so that they are not subject to re-victimization, and indeed then they're not kind of vulnerable to being re-trafficked. And this is one of our concerns at the moment, when we're seeing large numbers of people that are just being released from centers, that they are in a very vulnerable position to re-trafficking.
And the report points to corruption and collusion at multiple levels. How central do you think is official complicity to the survival of these scam operations, and where accountability has worked, what really made the difference?
Well, again, the reason that they're so entrenched, and the reason I think that we were writing this report 2.5 years later, is that there's an entrenching in terms of the business model of these scam operations. And certainly, again, as I said, we really welcome some very recent interventions from governments in the region to try to get to a place where the perpetrators are being identified, where there is rights-based prosecution. But at the same time, and then our report details that annual global profits of the scam industry in general are about $64 billion. Now, in a region that is suffering from high levels of debt distress, where many of the survivors told us that the reasons that they went into these operations, was because of high levels of poverty and inability to gain livelihoods. The kinds of profits from these scam operations is distorting, in a sense, the ability of governments to really reach deep into the roots of the operations and to be able to eradicate these business models, which are in a way that is meaningfully disruptive. And so, again, one of the recommendations that we have out of the report is that a vibrant civic space, so that where you have the ability of independent investigative journalists to carry out their kind of legitimate work to raise public awareness, to blow the whistle, where you have civil society organizations that are able to understand and speak on behalf of victims, where you have those guardrails, those checks and balances, that we would like to see in rules-based societies, then we can probably work towards meaningful disruption, as opposed to more performative raids or law enforcement operations. So we're really calling on the governments in the region as well to look at, kind of how to ensure that their societies are vibrant and resilient enough through ensuring civic space to be able to reach into the roots of what is a very pernicious business model built on, really unprecedented profits that are gained from these scams.
Absolutely. And as you've mentioned, civic space, guardrails are important. 70% of survivors from the report say that they would still consider migrating again after returning home. How does that really challenge the idea that awareness alone can prevent trafficking, and what deeper failures in labor migration systems does it expose?
No, thank you for that. And indeed, one of the other aspects of the report that we really tried to kind of, put a new and innovative lens onto was prevention, and to understand really through a behavioral lens, what is it that is still causing people to come into these operations. We found indeed that the information provision was only one aspect. So the fact that many people didn't know that scam operations existed, many people were not aware, links into some existing deficits around labor migration recruitment, so that where you have situations where people could not meaningfully know whether what the job ad that they were answering would either lead into a regular labor migration opportunity or on the other hand, lead into trafficking and exploitation in these very brutal scam operations. It wasn't easy for people that are in an urgent need, as I said, in livelihood distress, in urgent need to bring in, sufficient income for their families, for their communities. And what we found was that there's very powerful behavioral enablers that are leading people into them, not as a matter, as one of the survivors that we quote in the report, not as a matter of them being greedy or stupid, but really because there's no meaningful way in the way that recruitment is being organized around labor migration. There's very little ability for people to make the distinction through very sophisticated operations. The recruitment operations that are carried out by the scam centers are very, very sophisticated, multi-level. Yes. So we do want to call for safe labor migration pathways too.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that and for speaking with us. And that was Pia Oberoi speaking to us. Thank you so much.